Tonight I reveal the fastest way to change money. Not hustling, not affirming all day, but becoming the one for whom money is ordinary, then entering the Sabbath. This is where the teaching of Neville Goddard strikes with surgical precision. Neville was uncompromising in his central claim. Money is an effect, not a cause. It does not originate anything. It does not decide anything. It moves only when something deeper has already moved. He used the analogy of the shadow to make this unmistakably clear. A shadow has no life of its own. It does not initiate motion. It cannot change direction by will or effort. If the shadow shifts, it is only because the body casting it has shifted first. To argue with the shadow, to plead with it, to chase it, is to misunderstand reality entirely. And yet this is exactly what most people do with money. They negotiate with the effect while ignoring the cause. They pray to the shadow and wonder why it remains unmoved. When this truth is finally seen, not intellectually, but experientially, something irreversible begins to happen. Money stops feeling serious. It stops feeling heavy, charged, sacred, or dangerous. It no longer carries emotional authority. You do not wake up thinking about it with urgency or anxiety. You do not scan the world for signs of its arrival. You do not flinch at its temporary absence. The chase ends. The fear dissolves. The worship collapses, not because you have become indifferent or irresponsible, but because you have shifted position. You are no longer standing at the level of effect. You have moved upstream to the level of cause. And from that vantage point, money cannot dominate you, it can only follow. This is the post-manifestation shift few people talk about, but everyone who truly applies the law recognizes. Before awakening, money feels like life itself. After awakening, it feels more like a report, useful, informative, but never commanding. You still use it, you still appreciate it, but you no longer consult it to determine who you are or what is possible. It stops being chased because you know it cannot lead. It stops being feared because you know it cannot decide. And it stops being worshipped because you know it was never alive. The meaning of money changes forever, not because the world has changed, but because you have remembered the level at which creation actually occurs. This understanding was not unique to Neville. Long before these ideas were popularized, Wallace D. Wattles articulated the same law in a different language. He insisted that wealth does not come from struggle, competition, or cleverness, but from a certain state of being, not from effort alone, but from alignment, not from exhausting the body, but from occupying the correct consciousness. He made it clear that money flows as a consequence, not as a reward. It is drawn to a state, not earned through suffering. And when you truly grasp this, the frantic seriousness around money begins to look almost superstitious, like an old ritual performed long after its meaning has been forgotten. What I want you to hear, at the deepest level, is this. The shift you are about to explore is not about getting more money. It is about removing money from a position it never deserved. It is about restoring cause to its rightful place and demoting effect back to where it belongs. After true manifestation, money does not vanish from your life. It vanishes from its false pedestal. It becomes lighter, neutral, responsive. It appears and disappears without shaking your identity, because your sense of supply is no longer outsourced to numbers, accounts, or symbols. Something subtle yet profound happens after manifestation that few people can explain, yet everyone who has experienced it recognizes instantly. Money stops feeling serious, not trivial, not meaningless, but no longer loaded with emotional gravity. Before, it carried weight. It could tighten your chest or relax your shoulders. It could decide whether a day felt hopeful or heavy. It could dictate how you spoke, how you planned, how you saw yourself in relation to others. But after manifestation, that intensity fades, not because money is gone, but because its spell is broken. You are no longer psychologically kneeling before it. The charge drains out of it, and what remains is simply a tool, a symbol, an outcome that responds rather than commands. This shift is not forced. It is not an attitude you adopt or a mindset you practice. It happens naturally when understanding replaces superstition. Think of a person who once lived in fear of darkness, convinced it was filled with unseen threats. The moment light is understood and electricity becomes familiar, that fear dissolves. They no longer pray to the light switch. They no longer feel gratitude toward the bulb as if it were benevolent. They flip the switch without emotion, without reverence, without hesitation. Not because they disrespect light, but because they understand the mechanism behind it. The mystery is gone, and with it the seriousness. Money follows the same pattern. When you did not understand its cause, you treated it like a power in its own right. You negotiated with it emotionally. You felt guilt around it, desperation toward it, relief because of it. But once manifestation reveals itself in lived experience, once you see money arrive without struggle, without linear effort, without obeying the rules you were taught it must obey, something clicks into place. You realize you were never dealing with money itself. You were dealing with an effect, responding faithfully to a cause you had unknowingly moved. At that point, seriousness collapses. Not irresponsibility, not carelessness, but the solemn tension around money evaporates. You stop assigning it moral value. You stop treating it as evidence of worth or failure. You no longer read your future in your bank balance. Money becomes informational rather than existential. It tells you what state you have occupied, not who you are or what you can become. And because of that, it loses its emotional leverage. It can no longer threaten you, because it was never the authority to begin with. There is a strange moment that arrives quietly, often without ceremony, when you realize you were never actually taught the real cause at all. No one sat you down and explained it in a way the mind could fully grasp. There was no formal initiation, no dramatic announcement. Instead, understanding crept in through experience. Money appeared in ways that did not match the effort you applied. Opportunities unfolded without strain. Resources arrived through channels you did not plan or predict. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the mind was forced to admit that something else had been at work all along. It is similar to watching a film for years without ever questioning the screen. You laugh, you cry, you react to the images as if they possess substance and power. Then one day you notice the projector, not because someone explained it to you, but because the illusion broke on its own. Once you see the projector, the movie screen loses its mystery instantly. The characters no longer control you. The plot no longer traps you. You understand that everything appearing on the screen is downstream from a single source hidden behind it. The screen did not create the movie. It merely received it. This is what happens when the imaginal act reveals itself as the true source. You discover, not through theory but through lived confirmation, that something within you moved first. Before the money arrived, before the circumstance changed, before the external rearrangement occurred, there was an inner shift, a decision without effort, a knowing without proof, a subtle assumption that settled into place and began to feel natural. At the time, you may not have recognized it as the cause. You might have dismissed it as coincidence, luck, or timing. But once the pattern repeats, denial becomes impossible. What you uncover in that realization is unsettling to the old identity, because if imagination is the projector, then effort is no longer the lever you thought it was. Hustle loses its status as a creator and is revealed as a possible byproduct at best. Strategy becomes optional rather than sacred. Planning is no longer worshipped. This does not mean action disappears, but it is demoted from the throne of causation. Action becomes an expression of state, not the engine of results. It flows when appropriate and pauses when unnecessary, without anxiety either way. At a certain stage of understanding, the very phrase "trying to get money" begins to sound strange, almost outdated, as though it belongs to a version of yourself that no longer exists. Not because money has become unimportant, but because the logic behind chasing it collapses once cause and effect are properly ordered. To try implies distance. It implies absence. It assumes that what you want is somewhere else, withheld, separate from you, and must be reached through effort, persuasion, or time. But once you recognize yourself as the source, that assumption can no longer stand. The language of pursuit loses coherence because you are no longer dealing with something external to acquire. This is where the distinction between being and seeking becomes unmistakably clear. Seeking is always tense. It carries urgency, impatience, and the subtle belief that fulfillment lies ahead in some conditional future. Being, on the other hand, is quiet. It is settled. It does not rush, because it is not moving toward itself. You do not chase air in order to breathe. You breathe naturally once you are alive. The breath comes because life is already present, not because you successfully hunted it down. In the same way, Money begins to flow naturally when the state that implies its presence is occupied, not when it is desperately pursued. What changes here is not the outer behavior, but the inner orientation. Before, effort was fueled by lack. You acted in order to compensate for what you believed was missing. Every move carried a hidden question: will this finally be enough? After awakening, action, when it occurs, comes from sufficiency. It is no longer an attempt to fill a void, but an expression of a fullness that is already assumed. And because the motive has changed, the emotional charge around money dissolves. There is no longer a sense of life or death urgency attached to outcomes, because identity is no longer on the line. This is also why the old concept of persistence begins to feel misapplied. Persistence, as it was once understood, meant pushing against resistance, repeating effort in the face of doubt, forcing consistency through willpower. But once seeking ends, that form of persistence becomes unnecessary and even contradictory. You do not persist in trying to be what you already are. You do not repeatedly convince yourself of a fact you know to be true. The idea of keeping at it makes sense only when you believe the state has not yet been reached. Instead, persistence is quietly redefined. It becomes loyalty to an assumed identity rather than endurance of effort. It is not about repeating actions, but about remaining internally faithful to a conclusion already accepted. This kind of persistence does not feel like work. It feels like normalcy, and that is precisely why trying to get money no longer makes sense. Trying belongs to the old worldview, where cause was external and results had to be wrestled from the world. Once that worldview dissolves, so does the need to chase what can only ever follow. If money follows consciousness, stay here. Subscribe where the cause is taught. Once the shift from seeking to being has occurred, persistence takes on an entirely different meaning, one that is often misunderstood by those who have not yet crossed this threshold. Persistence is no longer about effort applied over time. It is no longer about repetition born of doubt. It becomes something far more subtle and far more powerful: fidelity to the fulfilled state. To live from the end is not to constantly imagine it, rehearse it, or remind yourself of it, but to respond to life from the position of its already being so. The state, once assumed, begins to speak for itself. Consider how you relate to your own name. You do not rehearse ownership of it each morning. You do not affirm it, visualize it, or attempt to believe it more deeply. You simply answer when it is spoken. Your response is automatic, unforced, and unquestioned. There is no effort involved because there is no uncertainty. The name is yours, and your behavior reflects that fact without conscious management. This is precisely how persistence functions after awakening. It is not a practice layered on top of doubt, but a natural consistency that arises from certainty. Living from the end means your inner reactions shift before your circumstances do. You notice yourself thinking, speaking, and deciding from a place that already assumes completion. The future is no longer consulted for reassurance. The past is no longer mined for evidence. You move through the present with a quiet knowing that does not need reinforcement. And because this orientation is internal, it does not depend on outer validation to sustain itself. The state stabilizes not through force, but through familiarity. It becomes your psychological home. As this stability deepens, something remarkable happens to effort. It dissolves into normalcy. Actions still occur, but they are no longer charged with desperation or expectation. You do not act in order to make something happen. You act because it makes sense within the state you occupy. Just as a person who knows their destination does not anxiously question every step, you move without overthinking the path. The state itself organizes behavior naturally, without strain or micromanagement. As the fulfilled state stabilizes, another quiet shift takes place, one that is often mistaken for indifference but is actually mastery. The senses begin to lose their authority, not because they disappear, and not because you reject the physical world, but because they are no longer consulted as judges of truth. For most people, the senses are the final court of appeal. What they see, hear, touch, and measure determines what they believe is possible. If the numbers say no, the answer is no. If the evidence is missing, hope collapses. But once you have lived from the end, this hierarchy reverses. Inner fact quietly takes precedence over outer evidence. This does not happen through denial or mental struggle. You are not arguing with appearances or forcing yourself to ignore them. Instead, they simply stop carrying the same weight. Imagine receiving a weather report while sitting comfortably indoors. You hear that it is raining, storming, or freezing outside, but it no longer dictates your emotional state. You are aware of it without being governed by it. The report exists, but it does not command you. In the same way, the senses continue to report conditions, but they are no longer allowed to define reality for you. They become informational, not authoritative. The reason this shift feels so natural is because you have already experienced the unreliability of the senses firsthand. You have seen circumstances contradict themselves. You have watched money appear where logic said it could not. You have felt inner certainty long before outer confirmation arrived. Once that happens, the senses lose their monopoly on truth. They are exposed as delayed messengers rather than creators. What they show you is no longer taken as a verdict, but as a snapshot of something already decided elsewhere. As inner fact gains authority, emotional reactivity fades. The highs and lows once triggered by external changes begin to smooth out. You notice that your sense of stability no longer fluctuates with appearances. A lack does not provoke panic. A surplus does not produce intoxication. Both are seen as temporary expressions, moving in response to something deeper and more stable within you. This is not detachment from life, but freedom within it. You are present without being possessed. This loss of sensory authority is not the end of engagement with the world, but the end of being ruled by it. It prepares the ground for something even more profound: rest. Not rest as exhaustion's reward, but rest as confirmation. When the senses no longer demand constant reaction, the inner system quiets. The need to check, measure, verify, and control begins to fall away. And in that quieting, a deeper assurance starts to take root, one that does not depend on what can be seen. This is the threshold that leads naturally into Sabbath, where the struggle ends not because the world has complied, but because the inner work is complete. There is a point in this unfolding where striving simply falls away, not because you have given up, but because there is nothing left to complete. This is what is meant by the Sabbath. Not a day, not a ritual, not a pause imposed from exhaustion, but a state of inner finality. It arrives when the assumption has hardened into fact within you, when the end is no longer imagined as future, but accepted as present. At that moment, money stops being a problem altogether. Not because every external detail has already aligned, but because the question has been answered at the level where questions actually originate. The Sabbath feels unmistakable, yet difficult to describe to someone who has not entered it. It is not excitement, and it is not relief in the dramatic sense. It is quieter than both. It feels like the moment you stop stirring a dish because it tastes finished. Nothing is missing. Nothing needs correction. Continuing to interfere would only disturb what is already complete. In the same way, the inner movement toward money comes to a natural halt. The urge to fix, adjust, visualize, affirm, or check simply dissolves. Not through discipline, but through satisfaction. This rest is not laziness, nor is it withdrawal from life. It is the rest that comes from certainty. You are no longer holding the desire in place with effort. The desire has collapsed into identity. Money is no longer something you are trying to bring about. It is something that now belongs to the order of inevitability, and inevitability does not require vigilance. It unfolds without supervision. This is why the Sabbath cannot be forced. It comes only when the inner conclusion has been fully reached. As this rest settles in, a subtle but permanent inner relief emerges. It is not tied to circumstances, and it does not fluctuate with appearances. It feels like standing on solid ground after a long period of balancing. You are no longer bracing yourself for disappointment or preparing for struggle. The nervous system relaxes because it is no longer waiting for permission from the outer world. The decision has already been made, and the body responds to that decision by releasing tension it did not even know it was carrying. From this state, money ceases to provoke thought. You do not revolve around it mentally. You do not strategize emotionally. You do not rehearse explanations or outcomes. It occupies no more psychological space than any other resolved fact of life. This is the clearest sign that the Sabbath has been entered. The problem did not get solved by force. It dissolved through completion. And once this rest is established, what follows is not effort but movement, natural, unstrained, and strangely precise, flowing from a place that no longer doubts its own conclusion. Once the Sabbath has been entered, The entire relationship with money reorganizes itself without effort or announcement. Money no longer sits in the future as something to be reached, achieved, or secured. It quietly shifts position and becomes a sign, an echo rather than a target. You begin to notice that it follows your inner movement instead of leading it. It shows up not as something you aim for, but as something that confirms where you already are. And this reversal changes everything, because goals demand pursuit, while signs simply appear. Before this shift, money was treated as a destination. Life felt arranged around getting there. Decisions were filtered through the question of whether they would lead to more, protect what existed, or prevent loss. But once money becomes a sign, that entire structure collapses. You no longer organize your inner world around it, because it is no longer the reference point. The reference point is the state you occupy. Money now arrives as evidence that the state is active, much like footprints appearing behind a walker. They confirm movement, but they do not guide it. No one follows their own footprints to decide where to go next. This is why action begins to feel different after awakening. You still move, still respond to opportunities, still participate in the world, but the motivation has changed completely. You are no longer acting in order to produce money. You are acting because action arises naturally from the state you live in. Opportunities are recognized without desperation. Decisions are made without bargaining. You engage without the sense that everything depends on the outcome. And paradoxically, this is when money begins to flow with greater ease, because it is no longer burdened with the role of being your source. When money is treated as a goal, it carries pressure. It must perform. It must arrive on time. It must justify effort and soothe fear. But when it is recognized as a sign, it is freed from those expectations. It simply reflects. It mirrors. It bears witness to an inner position already taken. This is why it often appears in ways that feel almost casual, even anticlimactic. The drama is gone. The meaning has shifted. You receive it the way you receive confirmation, not the way you receive salvation. This change also alters how you interpret opportunities. You stop chasing them as lifelines and start recognizing them as bridges. They are no longer things you must seize in order to survive, but paths that unfold because the destination has already been assumed. You do not rush across them in fear of collapse. You walk them with calm recognition. They appear, you move, and money follows as a natural consequence, not as a prize. In this way, money becomes lighter, quieter, and far more cooperative. It no longer demands belief, attention, or emotional energy. It simply shows up where it belongs, when it belongs, as a faithful echo of a decision already made within you. And once money is seen this way, it can never again be mistaken for the goal. It has been permanently reassigned to its true role, a sign that the inner cause is active and alive. There is a stage in this unfolding where fear does not need to be confronted, healed, managed, or overcome, because it has quietly lost its foundation. This is not the dramatic kind of courage where fear is present, but ignored. It is subtler than that. It is the realization that the fear you once knew no longer has a logical place to land. It depended entirely on a misunderstanding, on the belief that money was the cause of your stability, your safety, your future. Once that belief collapses, fear is left without a structure to support it. It may attempt to surface out of habit, but it cannot anchor itself in conviction the way it once did. Before this shift, fear felt intelligent. It appeared to be backed by evidence. Numbers, timelines, responsibilities, and expectations all seemed to validate it. The mind could justify its anxiety by pointing to circumstances and calling them facts. But now, those same circumstances no longer carry the same authority. You have seen too much. You have witnessed money appear without permission from logic. You have felt certainty arrive before evidence. You have watched effects rearrange themselves after an inner conclusion was reached. That experience rewires the relationship between thought and belief. Fear no longer feels like wisdom. It feels outdated. This is why the change is irreversible. You can forget specific techniques. You can go through seasons of distraction. You can even temporarily slip into old patterns of thinking, but the core understanding remains intact. Once you know where the cause truly lies, you cannot convincingly pretend otherwise. It is like learning how balance works once you have ridden a bicycle. You may wobble, you may hesitate, you may even fall, but you never again believe that balance comes from the ground beneath you rather than from the alignment within you. The knowledge becomes embodied, not theoretical. What makes old fear impossible to return to is not constant confidence but perspective. You no longer interpret fluctuations in money as existential threats. A decrease does not feel like danger. A delay does not feel like punishment. A pause does not feel like failure. You understand at a level deeper than emotion that the effect can fluctuate without the cause being disturbed. The inner position remains stable even when the outer picture is in motion. And because of that, fear loses its urgency. It no longer convinces you that something must be fixed immediately, or else everything collapses. Another subtle change occurs here that is often overlooked. Your nervous system begins to respond differently. Previously, money-related thoughts triggered bodily reactions: tightness, restlessness, pressure, urgency. Now those reactions either soften or fail to arise at all. Not because you are suppressing them, but because the interpretation that once fueled them is gone. The body responds to meaning. When money stops meaning survival, worth, or identity, the body no longer reacts as if it is under threat. This is not emotional numbness, it is regulation born of clarity. Fear also loses its predictive power. It no longer feels like a warning about the future, but like an echo from the past. You recognize it as a remnant of an old state of consciousness, rather than a signal to act. And because you no longer identify with that state, fear passes through without commandeering your attention. You do not need to argue with it. You do not need to correct it. It dissolves on its own due to lack of agreement. What replaces fear is not excitement or blind optimism, but grounded stability. You move through financial decisions without inner drama. You respond instead of react. You consider without catastrophizing. Even uncertainty no longer feels hostile. It becomes part of the unfolding rather than a threat to your foundation. You trust the cause you have already proven, not because you are hoping, but because you know how reality actually organizes itself. This is why you cannot go back. The old fear required ignorance of cause. Once that ignorance is gone, fear has nothing left to convince you with. It belonged to a version of you that mistook shadows for substance and effects for power. That version has dissolved, and with it, the fear that once ruled your relationship with money quietly fades into irrelevance. Not through resistance, but through understanding. The treasury was never outside you. In the end, there is no dramatic finale, only recognition. A quiet, settled knowing replaces the urgency that once surrounded money. You see, without needing reassurance, that the treasury was never located in figures, systems, or external sources. It was always seated in consciousness itself. Money was never the origin of security or freedom. It was the witness to an inner position already occupied. Once this is understood, the struggle around money collapses naturally, not through rejection, but through clarity. This was the essence of Neville Goddard's final teaching. Imagination is the only source. Everything else follows as an effect. Money does not initiate movement, it responds to it. It does not grant power, it reflects where power has already been assumed. When this order is restored, effort loses its former importance. Life begins to reorganize itself from the inside out, without force, persuasion, or strain. From this perspective, the lasting shift becomes obvious. Money does not follow effort, it follows identity. It mirrors the state you live from, not the actions you perform. This is why circumstances can change without visible struggle, and why results often arrive after inner certainty, not before it. As James Allen observed, circumstances obediently mirror inward being. They do not question it, they reflect it faithfully. With this understanding, reverence and fear fall away from money without needing to deny or reject it. You no longer elevate it as a savior or resist it as a threat. It is allowed to take its rightful place as a neutral, responsive symbol. It comes and goes without shaking your sense of self, because your foundation is no longer built on effect. What remains is rest, not passivity, but Sabbath. The inner work is finished, and the knowing does not require maintenance. From this state, movement unfolds naturally. Bridges appear without strain, and money follows as it must. When the cause is remembered, the effect can never rule again. It is done.